My name is Mara Hale, 32 years old, a warrant officer in the United States Army. I was sitting in the witness box at the Alexandria Federal Courthouse. The defense attorney, a fat, slick man, was smirking at the jury. He pointed at me. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice dripping with contempt, "my client is being accused by her, a warrant officer. Let's be blunt, she's an accountant in uniform, a mere logistics specialist who deals in inventory sheets. What qualifies a bean counter like her to allege a sophisticated conspiracy of this magnitude?" The courtroom was silent. I leaned toward the microphone, my voice as cold and precise as a scalpel. "You're right. I am a soldier, and my job is to find what people try to hide. Your client has a discrepancy of $1.2 million. But she made one mistake. She hid it inside a human being. If you've ever had someone look you in the face and tell you that you're not enough, that you're just a number, let me know where you're watching from. Go ahead and hit subscribe, because this story is for you. But to understand that moment in the courtroom, we have to go back 3 months. Back to the day my past collided with my present. It began as just another Tuesday. The morning sun cast long, sharp shadows across the manicured lawns of Fort Belvoir, Virginia. My work, however, took place far from the sunlight, deep inside the climate-controlled corridors of power. I was at the headquarters of Lieutenant General Thorne, conducting a routine logistics compliance audit. His office was exactly what you'd expect for a 3-star general. Immaculate, imposing, and smelling of expensive coffee and polished mahogany. A large oak desk stood like a fortress, flanked by the American flag and the 3-star general's standard. To me, it was just a workspace. The rank on the door didn't intimidate me. The numbers on the spreadsheets were my terrain. My eyes scanned columns of acquisition dates, serial numbers, and maintenance logs. My mind was a silent, efficient engine, cross-referencing, flagging discrepancies invisible to most. They call me the scalpel in CID. Not because I'm a threat in a fight, but because my precision in an audit can cut a criminal enterprise out of the Army's books without anyone realizing they're bleeding until it's too late. I find the waste, the fraud, the carefully concealed theft that others miss. I'd built my entire career, my entire identity, on this principle. I found safety in numbers because, unlike people, numbers never lie. People lied. Ambition corrupted. Emotions clouded judgment. But a number was pure truth. It was the only thing I'd ever been able to trust. I was finishing up, running a final check on the inventory of classified electronics. I leaned over the general's desk to verify the serial number on a hardened laptop, the low hum of the machine a steady presence in the quiet room. As I straightened up, my eyes drifted across the personal items arranged with military neatness on his desk blotter. A heavy brass challenge coin from the 101st Airborne Division sat next to an ornate pen set. And tucked just behind the coin, almost as an afterthought, was a small, sterling silver picture frame, its edges tarnished from years of being cherished. The photo inside was faded. It showed a little girl, maybe 8 years old, with a wide, gap-toothed grin that radiated pure, uncomplicated joy. She was missing one of her front teeth, and her hair was a messy halo in the bright sunshine, a sweet, anonymous face. But my mind, trained to spot the smallest detail, the single digit out of place, locked onto an imperfection. A tiny detail that made the air in my lungs feel like it had been ripped out. There, just above her chin, was a tiny, pale, crescent-shaped scar, almost invisible against her skin. The world narrowed to that single, silver frame. The quiet hum of the office electronics faded into a dull roar in my ears. The clipboard in my hand, which had felt weightless moments before, was suddenly as heavy as a concrete block. I felt the plastic creak in my tightening grip, my knuckles white. My breath hitched in my throat. I knew that scar. The memory wasn't a thought, it was a physical sensation. The summer heat on my skin, the grit of the St. Jude's orphanage yard under my worn-out sneakers, the phantom weight of that sharp-edged piece of gravel in my small hand. We were playing pirates, screaming with laughter as we charged across the dusty, sun-baked patch of dirt that served as our whole world. She was the captain, of course. She was always the captain. I was just the clumsy first mate who tripped over his own feet. I'd fallen, my hand lurching out to break my fall, the sharp rock I'd been holding scraping across her chin. I remembered the single, perfect drop of blood that welled up, her small gasp of pain, and the wave of guilt that had washed over me. Maria, my only friend. The name echoed in the silent chambers of my heart, a place I hadn't visited in 20 years. The carefully constructed walls of Warrant Officer Hale, the scalpel, crumbled into dust. All that was left was Mara, the orphan from St. Jude's. "Sir," the word escaped my lips as a ragged whisper, a complete breach of my own rigid military bearing. I couldn't look away from the picture. "Sir, I know this girl." My voice cracked. We were at St. Jude's together. General Thorne, a man who commanded thousands of soldiers and controlled billion-dollar budgets, went completely still. He had been reviewing a report, his posture one of effortless command. But at my words, the man disappeared and the mask of the general shattered. The change was terrifying to watch. The steel in his eyes dissolved into something raw, fragile, and utterly human. He shot up from his leather chair so fast it screeched against the polished floor, the sound violent in the quiet office. His voice, when it came, was not the measured baritone of a commander. It was the choked, broken rasp of a grieving father. "That's impossible." He stared at me, his eyes wide with a wild, desperate hope that was painful to see. He crossed the room in 2 strides and snatched the frame from his desk, holding it as if it were a holy relic. "That is my daughter, Era." His voice broke on her name. She was kidnapped from a park in Arlington 15 years ago. 2 names, 2 stories, 1 scar. And in that deafening, heart-stopping moment of collision, as I looked from the girl in the photo to the broken man in front of me, I knew. I knew with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the numbers I trusted. I knew who stood in the middle of it all. Standing in the general's office, I was no longer Warrant Officer Hale. I was back at St. Jude's. Back to the place where I learned my first lesson: I was nothing. St. Jude's orphanage wasn't a home. The sisters who ran it tried to make it one, with their gentle hymns and worn-out Bibles, but their efforts were smothered by the building itself. It was an institution, plain and simple. The air was heavy with the sterile, chemical tang of industrial bleach and the thin, watery smell of cheap cabbage soup that seemed to seep into the very plaster. The walls weren't a cheerful yellow or a calming blue. They were a dull, lifeless battleship gray, the kind of color that absorbs light and hope in equal measure. Every sound echoed in the long, linoleum-tiled hallways. The squeak of our shoes, the clang of a dropped spoon, the rustle of our thin, scratchy blankets at night. Everything and everyone was managed by the director, Mrs. Albright. She was a tall, severe woman with hair pulled back into a bun so tight it seemed to pull the skin taut across her cheekbones. Her eyes were the color of a winter sky, and they never, ever smiled. They didn't show anger or kindness, they just calculated. The only thing she ever carried was a large, black, leather-bound ledger. It never left her side. It was her Bible, her constant companion. And within its pages, we weren't children with dreams and fears. We were assets. We were line items, mouths to feed, beds to fill, expenses to be managed, and ultimately, just numbers on a page. I learned that lesson before I even knew what a ledger was. I was a quiet child, observant. It was my defense mechanism in a world that was too loud and too harsh. And one winter, when I was about 9, I noticed something. A local church had run a coat drive for us, and the donation bins in the storage room were overflowing with brand new, puffy winter jackets in bright, beautiful colors. I counted them, 75 coats. But later, I overheard Mrs. Albright telling a state inspector that the orphanage had only received 45. I saw the number written in her neat, precise handwriting in the ledger. Donated goods, winter apparel, 45 units. Thinking I was being helpful, that I had found a simple mistake, I sought her out. I found her in her office, the smell of mothballs and old paper thick in the air. I pointed out the discrepancy, my small voice barely a whisper. Ma'am, I counted. There are 30 more coats in the storage room. She didn't thank me. She didn't even look surprised. She simply placed her pen down, folded her hands on top of her ledger, and stared at me. The silence stretched, and I felt myself shrink under her cold gaze. Hale, she finally said, her voice like ice cracking. She always called us by our last names, like we were recruits, not children. You are a number here, honey. Number 117, to be precise. Don't you ever forget that. And don't you ever try to be anything more. That was it. Dismissed. I walked out of that office with her words branded onto my soul. I was just a number. Insignificant. Replaceable. But Maria was different. She wasn't a number. She was a firework. She had a spirit that the gray walls of St. Jude's couldn't contain. She believed in things. She believed in fairy tales, in happy endings, and in the inherent goodness of people. A belief I had lost long ago. I remember one Thanksgiving, a wealthy benefactor from a local corporation, a man with a kind smile and a shiny car, arranged for a full catered dinner to be delivered to us. For one glorious hour, the dining hall smelled not of cabbage, but of roasted turkey, savory stuffing, cinnamon, and pumpkin pie. We stared at the feast, our eyes wide with disbelief. It was a miracle. But the moment the benefactor's car pulled out of the driveway, Mrs. Albright clapped her hands sharply. "All right, that's enough," she announced. Her staff began clearing the tables, packing the glistening turkey and the perfect pies back into their aluminum trays. "This food is far too rich for your systems," she explained to our crestfallen faces. That night, for Thanksgiving dinner, we ate stale bread dipped in thin, lukewarm soup. The next morning, I was awake before dawn, and I watched from a grimy dormitory window as Mrs. Albright's brother-in-law loaded the back of his pickup truck. It was filled to the brim with our Thanksgiving dinner. She hadn't thrown it away. She had stolen it. She had stolen our one day of joy. If you've ever had something you were looking forward to cruelly taken away, hit that like button. And in the comments below, just type one word. Unforgivable. Because that's exactly what it was. And then one day, Maria was gone. It was a Tuesday, just like any other. But at breakfast, her seat was empty. Mrs. Albright stood before us, her ledger tucked under her arm, and made the announcement in her usual flat, emotionless tone. Maria Hale, she told us, had been adopted by a wonderful family in a distant state. Just like that. No goodbye, no forwarding address, no chance to hug my only friend one last time. She just vanished. A number erased from one column and, I would later learn, entered into another. The cold, wrong feeling of her disappearance never left me. It settled deep in my bones, a permanent chill that no donated coat could ever warm. Mrs. Albright had taught me my lesson well. I was a number, and numbers were meaningless unless they were part of a system you controlled. So, on my 18th birthday, I walked out of St. Jude's and into an Army recruitment office. I enlisted. I joined a world where numbers meant everything. They meant order, discipline, and structure. They meant a rifle serial number, a grid coordinate, a mission timeline. In the Army, I could finally take the very thing that was meant to make me feel worthless and turn it into a weapon. I joined the Army to get away from Mrs. Albright, but I quickly learned that the world is full of its own Albrights. They just wear different uniforms. Becoming a warrant officer in the Criminal Investigation Command, CID, isn't the glamorous path you see in movies. It's not about kicking down doors or high-speed chases, at least not for me. The special agents, the ones with the badges and the bravado, they handle the murders, the assaults, the headline-grabbing crimes. Me? I follow the numbers. I hunt in the digital wilderness of procurement contracts, deployment manifests, and financial disclosures. I am a forensic accountant with a top-secret clearance and a service weapon I rarely unholster. It's a quiet, meticulous, and often thankless job. And no one made that clearer than my direct superior, Colonel Jennings. He was a man carved from the old Army mold, broad-shouldered, gravelly voiced, with a firm belief that real soldiering involved mud and gunpowder, not spreadsheets and calculators. He never hid his disdain for my work. In our weekly briefings, surrounded by agents who had spent their week interviewing witnesses to violent crimes, he would inevitably turn to me, a dismissive smirk playing on his lips. "Hale," he'd drawl, making sure everyone in the room was listening. "When are you going to stop playing with your spreadsheets and get out there and do some real soldiering?" He coined the name for me himself. To Colonel Jennings and soon to the rest of the unit, I was the accountant in uniform. It wasn't a compliment. It was a label meant to diminish, to separate my work from the real work of CID. The label stuck, and it became the lens through which he viewed every piece of intelligence I brought him. About a year ago, I stumbled upon a pattern while auditing fuel contracts for a forward operating base in Afghanistan. It was subtle, just a few cents overcharge per gallon here, a few phantom shipments there. But the numbers added up. Over 6 months, it amounted to nearly $500,000. It was a sophisticated fraud, buried under layers of subcontracting and forged delivery receipts. I spent weeks piecing it together, my findings culminating in a 40-page report that laid out the entire scheme. I presented it to Jennings in his office, feeling a rare flicker of pride. I had found the ghost in the machine. He took the report, his eyes scanning the executive summary with impatience. He flipped a few pages, his expression unchanging. Then he tossed it back onto his desk. The slap of the binder against the wood echoed the slap of Mrs. Albright's ledger. "You have no hard evidence, Hale," he said, his voice flat. "You've got a pile of numbers and a theory. Stop wasting my time with these half-baked conspiracies." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You're a logistics specialist. Stick to logistics." An order. A dismissal. The ghost of Mrs. Albright's voice echoed in my ears. "Don't you ever try to be anything more." He wouldn't authorize the manpower for a full investigation. He said we had real cases to worry about. So, I did it myself. My days were for the work Jennings assigned me. My nights were for the fuel case. While the other agents were at home with their families, I was alone in our sterile, fluorescent-lit office. The only sounds were the hum of my computer and the occasional rattle of the HVAC system kicking in. I subsisted on stale coffee from the break room pot and protein bars I kept in my desk drawer. Night after night, I sat there, my eyes burning from staring at the screen, meticulously cross-referencing shipping manifests from the port in Karachi with fuel invoices from Bagram. It was a lonely, exhausting battle, fought with nothing but data and my own stubborn refusal to be wrong. And I wasn't. After 3 weeks of sleepless nights, I found it. The undeniable proof. A digital signature on a falsified delivery confirmation that traced back to a shell corporation owned by the brother of the on-site contracting officer. It was the smoking gun. I proved the case. I saved the Army $500,000. But there was no commendation. There was no apology from Jennings. He simply took my completed file, put his own name on the final report to the Inspector General, and accepted the credit during a command briefing. That was my life in the unit. A constant, silent struggle to prove my worth. A relentless fight to be seen as more than just a number cruncher. I was fighting alone, surrounded by soldiers who were supposed to be my brothers and sisters in arms. The only glimmers of light came from the most unexpected places. It was late one night, probably 2 a.m, during that fuel investigation. I was slumped over my keyboard on the verge of giving up, the sheer volume of data threatening to swallow me whole. The office was dark except for the glow of my monitor. Suddenly, a shadow fell over my desk. I looked up to see Chief Warrant Officer Thompson from Food Service. He was a quiet, older man with kind eyes and hands permanently stained from years of working in Army kitchens. We'd never spoken more than a few words in passing. He didn't say much. He just placed a steaming ceramic mug of coffee on my desk. Real coffee, not the sludge from the break room. He must have brewed it himself. He gently patted my shoulder, his touch surprisingly steady. "Scalpel," he said, using my nickname with a respect Jennings never showed. "Don't let the bastards grind you down." And then he was gone, his footsteps silent down the empty hall. It was such a small gesture, a cup of coffee and 10 quiet words. But in the crushing isolation of that moment, it meant the world. It was a lifeline. It was a quiet acknowledgement from one overlooked soldier to another. It reminded me that even in the shadows, I wasn't entirely invisible. The shockwave that hit General Thorne's office lasted only a few seconds. The ghost of little Mara, the orphan girl trembling with a memory she thought she'd buried, receded. In her place, CID investigator Hale took control. His grief was a tangible force in the room, a raw, gaping wound. But I was a soldier on duty, and I had just identified a threat. "Sir," I said, my voice steady and even, cutting through the heavy silence. The calm authority in my tone was deliberate, designed to pull him back from the edge of his personal abyss. He looked up, his eyes unfocused, lost in a 15-year-old nightmare. I held his gaze. "With all due respect, General, I don't believe your daughter was kidnapped in the way the police thought. I believe she was sold." I let the ugly word hang in the air between us. I believe she was moved through a corrupt adoption ring operating out of St. Jude's orphanage. I took a breath, delivering the final, critical blow. And I believe Mrs. Albright is the one who ran it. For a moment, the broken father vanished, and the 3-star general returned. The grief in his eyes hardened into something else, a cold, brutal resolve. Steel replaced the sorrow. "I'll have her arrested," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. He reached for the secure phone on his desk, his knuckles white. "I'll have a team from the Provost Marshal's office pick her up within the hour." "No, sir," I interrupted, a breach of protocol I wouldn't have dared with any other officer. "You can't." He froze, his hand hovering over the phone, his eyes flashing with anger. "Sir, the original case is a 15-year-old civilian kidnapping. It's cold, and it's outside of CID's jurisdiction. A military arrest would be thrown out, and it would tip our hand. She would lawyer up and bury any evidence so deep we'd never find it." He stared at me, the gears turning behind his eyes. I pressed my advantage, my mind racing, connecting the dots just as I would with any financial crime. "But," I said, my voice lowering slightly, "St. Jude's has received millions of dollars in federal grants over the past 2 decades. A significant portion of which, according to public records I've seen, came from Department of Defense outreach programs. This was my territory. This was where the numbers lived. That gives my office jurisdiction, sir. Not for kidnapping, but for a financial investigation into fraud, waste, and abuse of federal funds directed at the orphanage." It was a legal loophole, a backdoor, but it was the only way in. The rage drained from his face, replaced by a calculated stillness. The full weight of his position, his power, seemed to settle back onto his shoulders. But then, as he looked at me, a low-ranking warrant officer standing in his imposing office, it all fell away again. The stars on his collar seemed to disappear. He wasn't a general anymore. He was just a man who had lost his child. "Warrant officer," he said, and his voice cracked, the sound of a man holding on by a thread. He sank back into his chair, the powerful frame suddenly looking frail. "My command authority. I can't officially task you with this. It would be a gross overreach." He looked down at his hands, then back up at me, and his eyes were pleading. "But as a man, as a father, I'm asking you. Please, find my daughter." That was it. That was the moment that changed everything. All my life, I had been a number, a line item, an accountant in uniform to be dismissed or used. Mrs. Albright, Colonel Jennings, they saw me as a function, a tool. But this man, this powerful, heartbroken general, saw me. He wasn't giving me an order. He was asking for my help. He needed me. And for the first time in my 32 years, I felt the profound, staggering weight of someone's absolute trust. The invisible girl from St. Jude's, the one who was told to never be anything more than a number, was now the only hope for one of the most powerful men in the country. "I'll do it, sir," I said, my voice firm with a newfound purpose. There was no hesitation. This was my mission now. He gave a sharp, decisive nod, the general returning for a final, crucial act. He picked up his phone. I can't officially interfere with your investigation, Hale, he said, his voice now laced with cold steel. But I can clear the road for you. He pressed a button on the console. Get me Federal Judge Marks on the line, he commanded his aide. Tell his clerk this is a matter of national security. The weight of those two words could move mountains in Washington. He locked eyes with me as he waited, the phone pressed to his ear. You'll have 20 years of St. Jude's unredacted financial records on your desk by 800 tomorrow. A connection was made on the other end of the line, and he turned away slightly, his voice dropping. Mark, it's Thorne. I'm calling in a favor. He hung up a few moments later and looked at me, his expression a grim mask. The alliance was forged. He was the power, and I was the weapon. Go get that monster, warrant officer. I left General Thorne's office walking on air, feeling a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. The mission was no longer an abstract hunt for financial ghosts in the machine. It was for a little girl with a gap-toothed grin. It was for Maria. For the first time, my unique skills felt less like a defense mechanism and more like a righteous weapon. The quiet hope humming in my chest was an unfamiliar, welcome warmth against the cold I'd carried for so long. The feeling lasted for the 30-second walk from the command wing back to the CID section of the building. But the second I pushed through the keypad-locked door into my own office, I hit a wall. That wall's name was Colonel Jennings. I hadn't even made it back to my desk, my mind already outlining the first steps of the investigation, when my desk phone began to ring. A shrill, piercing sound in the relative quiet of the office. I didn't even need to look at the caller ID. Only one person used the internal line with that kind of impatient urgency. I picked up the receiver. Hale. My office. Now, he growled, and the line went dead. No greeting, no preamble, just a summons. The walk to his office, a path I'd taken 1,000 times, felt different. Each step seemed to pull me further away from the light of General Thorne's trust and deeper into a familiar shadow. The low hum of fluorescent lights, the quiet clatter of keyboards from other agents in their cubicles, the smell of burnt coffee from the break room, it all felt oppressive. The warmth of my new purpose was already cooling, replaced by a knot of dread twisting in my stomach. When I stepped inside his office, the atmosphere was thick enough to choke on. Jennings wasn't behind his desk. He was standing by the window overlooking the vast gray parking lot, his hands clasped behind his back. He held himself with the rigid stillness of a predator waiting for its prey to wander into the trap. He didn't turn as I entered and closed the door behind me with a soft click. Warrant Officer Hale, he said to the glass, his voice deceptively soft, carrying a dangerous razor-thin edge. He finally turned, his eyes like chips of granite, cold and hard. What in the hell were you doing in General Thorne's office? The question hit me with the force of a physical blow. The meeting had ended less than 20 minutes ago. My mind, trained to analyze data flow, went into overdrive. The speed was impossible. A meeting at that level, on such a sensitive topic. For the information to travel from a 3-star general's office to his, it wouldn't go through normal channels. It would require a direct, privileged line of communication. A chill that had nothing to do with the office's aggressive air conditioning snaked its way up my spine. I willed my training to take over. I pulled my professional mask on, smoothing my features into a neutral slate. My posture instinctively shifted to a rigid, formal attention. Colonel, I was pursuing a lead on potential fraud of federal funds involving a civilian contractor. It was the official, sanitized truth. Jennings let out a short, ugly bark of a laugh. It was a sound entirely devoid of humor. A civilian contractor? He scoffed, his boots making no sound on the government-issue carpet as he moved toward his desk. Let's cut the crap, Hale. You mean St. Jude's orphanage, don't you? And a director by the name of Mrs. Albright? My blood ran cold. The dread in my stomach tightened into a painful, nauseating knot. He didn't just know about the meeting, he knew the names, the specifics. This wasn't a guess, it was confirmation. Someone hadn't just reported my presence, they had reported the entire conversation. Before I could process the implications, he was standing in front of me, his larger frame invading my personal space, forcing me to crane my neck slightly to meet his gaze. It was a classic power move, and he knew it. "Warrant officer," he said, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial whisper that was more menacing than a shout. "Let me give you a piece of advice. Mrs. Albright is a pillar of this community. She sits on charity boards, she attends fundraisers with senators and congressmen. She has friends in very, very high places." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in, his eyes boring into mine. Places much higher than a 3-star general who spends most of his time worrying about budgets. The threat was no longer veiled. It was a declaration. He was telling me Thorne's power, which had felt so absolute just moments before, had its limits. And we were about to find them. He backed away and settled into his large leather chair, steepling his fingers in a gesture of calm, unassailable authority. He looked at me as if I were a malfunctioning piece of equipment. "Look, Hale, I know you get a kick out of your numbers. It's what you do. You did good work on that fuel contract thing." The praise was a poisoned dart, meant to soften me up before the kill. But this is a different league. This isn't about some greedy contractor trying to skim a little off the top. This is about people who can end a career with a single phone call. "Do you understand me?" He leaned forward, his voice hardening into a command. "There is no case here, just some minor accounting errors in an old, dusty file. You will let it go. You will go back to your desk, and you will focus on the logistics audits I assign you. This investigation is over." It was a direct, unlawful order to obstruct justice. He was telling me to stand down, to abandon the only real lead in a 15-year-old crime, to abandon Maria, to abandon General Thorne. The hope that had filled me in the general's office felt like it was hemorrhaging out of me, draining onto the worn carpet of Jennings's office, leaving behind nothing but a familiar, hollow rage. I locked my knees, my body a rigid column of defiance on the inside, but a statue of obedience on the outside. My training warred with my conscience. My voice, when it came out, was flat, robotic, betraying none of the fury screaming inside my skull. "Yes, Colonel." "Good," he said, leaning back in his chair, the picture of a man satisfied with his own power. "Dismissed." I executed a crisp about-face and walked out of the office, my back straight, my steps measured and even. I didn't let myself breathe until the door clicked shut behind me. I stood in the hallway for a second, the cold professionalism I had worn like armor cracking under the pressure of a glacial rage. He wasn't just dismissing me. He wasn't just covering his own backside. He was actively protecting her. The speed, the specific names, the direct order to drop it all pointed to one terrifying conclusion. The system wasn't just broken, it was rotted from the inside. It was complicit. And as I walked back to my desk, the truth settled in, cold and hard as a tombstone. Mrs. Albright didn't just have a brother-in-law on her payroll, she had a full-bird colonel in her pocket, and I had just made an enemy of them both. I went back to my desk feeling utterly isolated. The rage from Jennings's office cooled into a familiar, heavy resignation. I followed the order. I opened my case management software, typed in the file number for the St. Jude's inquiry, and formally marked it as closed, unfounded. The click of the mouse felt like a betrayal. For one full day, I tried to believe I was wrong. I immersed myself in a mind-numbing audit of vehicle maintenance logs, forcing the image of Maria's face out of my head. I told myself Jennings was right, that it was just a coincidence, a ghost from the past that I needed to let go of. I tried to bury it. I tried to be a good soldier, until the email arrived. It came at exactly 1700 hours, 5 o'clock, the official end of the duty day. The timing was deliberate, a final power play before the weekend. An email notification popped up on my screen. The sender was Colonel Jennings. The subject line read, "Tasking adjustment, immediate." What caught my eye and made a cold pit form in my stomach was the recipient list. He had CC'd the entire CID unit, every agent, every analyst, every administrative clerk. This wasn't an order, this was a public statement. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened it. The text was brief, written in the cold, impersonal language of military bureaucracy. Effective immediately, Due to operational requirements, Warrant Officer Hale is temporarily reassigned to the National Training Center, Fort Irwin, California. Her mission will be to assist the Base G4 in a full-scale frontline warehouse inventory reconciliation. Her duties will include the physical verification and logging of all on-hand assets. Fort Irwin, the Army's premier training ground, located in the desolate heart of the Mojave Desert, a sprawling expanse of sand and rock where summer temperatures soared past 120 degrees. It was a place you sent units to prepare for war, not a forensic accountant to count crates of meals ready to eat. This wasn't a reassignment. It was an exile, a public shaming disguised as a duty. He was sending me to the middle of nowhere to count beans, making sure everyone knew I'd been put back in my place. My eyes scanned down the email, past the official signature block, and then I saw it. Tucked at the very bottom, visible only to me, not the CC list, a single, final line. I told you to stick to logistics. You're just a number, Hale, and your number just got called. The air left my lungs. The world went silent. You're just a number, honey. Number 117. Don't you ever try to be anything more. The voice of Mrs. Albright, cold and cruel from 20 years ago, merged seamlessly with Jennings's words on the screen. It was the same voice, the same message, the same casual, brutal dismissal of my entire existence. This was more than an insult. It was a psychological strike aimed with surgical precision at the oldest, deepest wound I had. He had found the broken piece of my soul and was grinding his heel into it. I just sat there, my hand frozen on the mouse, staring at the words. A tremor started in my fingers and spread through my entire body. It wasn't a shiver of fear. It was a seismic wave of pure, unadulterated rage. A rage so profound it burned away the resignation, the fatigue, the lifelong habit of quiet obedience. He was right. To him, to Albright, to all of them, I was just a number. An entry in a ledger. A cog in a machine to be moved or discarded at will. But he forgot one thing about the numbers I worked with. They were permanent. They left a trail. They held the truth, even when no one was looking for it. My gaze drifted to the secure STU-3 telephone on my desk. My direct line to allies in high places. One call to General Thorne would end this. He could crush Jennings, reverse the order, and protect me. But as I looked at the phone, a new, hard certainty formed in my heart. No, this wasn't Thorne's fight. This was mine. My whole life had been a battle fought in the shadows, a silent war against the ghosts of St. Jude's. This was the front line. My eyes fell on my go bag, a standard olive drab military pack resting by my desk. Tucked away in a side pocket, buried beneath spare batteries and a first aid kit, was a small pocket-sized Gideon's Bible with a worn blue cover. It was the only thing I had taken with me when I left the orphanage, not for any deep religious conviction, but because it was the only possession that was truly mine. If you believe that there comes a point where you have to stop taking it and start fighting back, hit that like button. And comment below with a simple, enough. Because that's the word that was screaming in my soul. My hands were steady now. I pulled the small book out. Its pages were soft and fragile from age. I opened it to a page I knew by heart, a passage the nuns at St. Jude's had made us memorize in the dusty, sunlit chapel. A single verse was underlined in faint pencil, a mark I had made as a lonely, hopeful child. John 8:32. And you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Free. The word resonated through me, not as a prayer, but as a plan of action. I stood up. The chair scraped against the floor, the sound decisive in the quiet office. Colonel Jennings had given me an order. He thought he had won, that he had exiled the problem. But he didn't know that General Thorne's favor hadn't been a verbal promise. It had been an electronic transfer of data. 20 years of St. Jude's financial records weren't sitting on a CID server that Jennings could control. They were waiting for me, encrypted and secure, inside a SCIF. A sensitive compartmented information facility that his authority couldn't touch. Jennings could send my body to the desert, but he couldn't stop what he had just started. He thought he was closing a file. He had just declared a war. I ignored the reassignment order. My flight to California wasn't for another 36 hours. Jennings had made a mistake. He'd given me a timeline, and in my world, a timeline is a window of opportunity. That night, instead of packing my desert gear, I drove my unremarkable civilian sedan to a secure, nondescript government building in Arlington, the kind of place that blends seamlessly into the corporate landscape of Northern Virginia. There were no signs, no flags, just a discreet keypad and a biometric scanner. I badged into the SCF at 2100 hours. This was my operation now. A sensitive compartmented information facility is a sterile, windowless box designed for one purpose: to keep secrets in. The moment the heavy, vault-like door hissed shut behind me, the outside world ceased to exist. There was no sound except for the low, constant hum of server fans and the whisper of the recycled air cycling through the vents. The air tasted metallic and cold. General Thorne had arranged my access. Inside, it was just me, two massive, high-resolution computer monitors, a secure terminal, and the digital ghost of 20 years of St. Jude's financial life. The rage that had propelled me here cooled into a laser-focused concentration. This wasn't an office. It was a battlefield. The rows and columns of the spreadsheets were the terrain. The bank statements, wire transfers, and tax filings were the enemy positions. My keyboard was my weapon. For hours, I worked in a state of pure, methodical flow. My fingers flew across the keys, running queries, cross-referencing datasets, building a financial map of Mrs. Albright's empire. I wasn't looking for a single, glaring piece of evidence, a smoking gun. Amateurs look for smoking guns. Professionals look for patterns, a signature. A recurring methodology of crime that becomes as unique as a fingerprint. I started with the adoption records, focusing on the year Maria disappeared. I cross-referenced the dates of each child's departure with St. Jude's donation logs. On the surface, everything looked clean. A child would be adopted, and within a few weeks, a large anonymous donation would appear in the orphanage's accounts. It was plausible. Grateful adoptive parents showing their appreciation. But it was too consistent, too perfect. At 0230 hours, fueled by lukewarm coffee from a thermos, I found it, Maria's file. The official record showed she was adopted by a loving couple from Ohio. But the corresponding donation, the one that arrived 2 weeks after she left, wasn't from a couple in Ohio. The wire transfer, for exactly $75,000, originated from a holding company I'd never heard of, Viridian Assets, LLC. A quick search showed Viridian Assets was registered in the Cayman Islands, a notorious haven for hiding money. No loving couple from the Midwest sends a donation through an offshore shell corporation. This was the first thread. I pulled. The $75,000 was the key. It was a clean, round number. Too clean. I switched to the IRS database, pulling up St. Jude's publicly available Form 990s, the annual tax filings required for nonprofit organizations. I scrolled through the revenue section for the year Maria was taken, and there it was. Listed under charitable contributions was a single, anonymous donation of $75,000. Albright wasn't just taking money, she was laundering it. She was using the tax-exempt status of a charity to wash dirty funds, disguising payments for children as philanthropic gifts. She had turned a human being into a tax write-off. My heart was pounding now, a steady rhythmic drum against my ribs. This was her signature. The offshore company was the weapon. The Form 990 was the concealment. I started a new search, looking for that exact pattern across all 20 years of data. How many other adoptions were followed by large, round-numbered donations from other anonymous shell corporations? The results populated the screen. 12. Over 2 decades, 12 children had been adopted under the same financial signature, each one a ghost, their true price hidden in plain sight. The final piece of the puzzle was Viridian Assets. Who owned it? It took another hour of digging through complex international business registries, peeling back layers of corporate ownership like an onion. The Cayman Islands Company was owned by a parent corporation in Delaware, another state known for its corporate secrecy. But Delaware law requires at least one officer to be publicly listed. I ran the search. The name that appeared on my screen made the breath catch in my throat. The sole registered agent of the parent company was a man named Martin G. Albright, Mrs. Albright's brother-in-law, the same man I had seen loading our stolen Thanksgiving dinner into the back of his pickup truck all those years ago. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. It wasn't a smile of happiness. It was a smile of grim, absolute certainty. The kind of smile a predator makes when it finally has its prey cornered. Mrs. Albright had built a fortress of paperwork and bureaucracy, a castle of lies protected by powerful friends and the world's indifference. She believed no one would ever care enough to look, that no one would have the skill to navigate her maze. She counted on the fact that the children she sold were invisible, worthless numbers in her grand calculation. But she made one fatal miscalculation. She never imagined that one of those numbers would grow up, join the United States Army, and become a specialist at the one thing that could bring her entire world crashing down. She never planned on me. My evidence, meticulously extracted from the digital ether of the SIF, was ironclad. It was enough for the U.S. Attorney's Office to convene a grand jury, which promptly returned a federal indictment against Mrs. Albright on 12 counts, including wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. My follow-up report on Colonel Jennings's deliberate obstruction of a federal investigation led to his quiet, unceremonious removal from command, pending a court-martial. The system, when forced into the light, had begun to work. And now, 3 months later, here I was, back where this story began, in the witness box of the Alexandria Federal Courthouse, facing Mrs. Albright's high-priced defense attorney. He was exactly the kind of man I expected. Overweight in an expensive suit, with a pinky ring that caught the light and a condescending smirk that never left his face. He was pacing in front of the jury box, his folksy charm just a thin veneer over a predator's instincts. He was in the middle of his cross-examination, and he was moving in for the kill. "So, Warrant Officer Hale," he began, his voice dripping with false deference. "Let's be clear for the jury. You have no formal training in child psychology, is that correct?" "That is correct," I answered, my voice even. "And no field experience investigating child abduction cases?" "Correct." "No specialized background in criminal profiling whatsoever?" "That is also correct." He stopped pacing and turned to face me fully, his smirk widening. He let the silence hang in the air for a dramatic beat. "So," he said, leaning against the railing of the jury box as if sharing a secret with them, "at the end of the day, you're a logistics specialist, aren't you? Your job is inventory." "Correct." My answers were short, crisp, giving him nothing to work with, but he thought he had me. He turned his back on me and addressed the jury directly, his arms spread wide in a gesture of shared disbelief. "Ladies and gentlemen, the government's entire case rests on the testimony of this witness, a woman who admits she knows nothing about the crimes my client is accused of. A career bean counter." He laughed, a short, dismissive bark, and the word hung in the air like a poisoned dart. That was the moment. The word he thought was his weapon, the insult Jennings had used, the label Albright had branded me with. It was the key. "Counselor," I said, my voice cutting through the courtroom, clear and sharp. It wasn't loud, but it commanded attention. The attorney froze, surprised that I had interrupted his performance. He turned slowly, his smirk faltering for the first time. "It is precisely because I am a logistics specialist that I caught your client," I stated, leaning slightly toward the microphone. I could feel every eye in the room lock onto me, the jury, the judge, the spectators, and Mrs. Albright. The lawyer's face went blank. I don't understand," he stammered, thrown off balance. "Let me explain it for you," I said, my voice as cold and precise as a scalpel. "Logistics, in its simplest form, is the science of moving an asset from point A to point B and concealing the trail. It's what I was trained by the U.S. Army to detect. Mrs. Albright was running a logistical operation. She moved her assets, in this case, vulnerable children, from point A, St. Jude's Orphanage, to point B, wealthy, desperate families. I paused, letting the jury absorb the horrifying substitution. And like any good logistician, she worked hard to cover her tracks. She used a series of offshore shell corporations to disguise the payments, laundering what you would call adoption fees into what she called anonymous charitable donations on her federal tax forms. I turned my gaze from the stunned lawyer and looked directly at the 12 men and women in the jury box. I spoke to them not as a soldier or a witness, but as someone telling a simple, terrible truth. But Mrs. Albright did more than just sell children. She erased them. In the military, we have a term for an asset that has been destroyed or lost, accounted for. That's what she did. She took a little girl named Maria, my friend, and turned her into a new asset named Ara. Then she helped stage a fake kidnapping to permanently sever the paper trail, to make the original asset impossible to trace. My voice dropped, becoming heavy with the weight of the accusation. She turned human beings into unaccounted-for numbers. Finally, I turned my head and looked, for the first time, directly at the defendant's table. I locked eyes with the woman in the sensible gray suit, the woman with the tightly pinned hair who had haunted my entire life. But she made a mistake, I said, my voice ringing with absolute finality. She couldn't sever the bank trail. She couldn't erase the wire transfers. She couldn't delete the numbers. And my job, my only job, is to find the numbers. That's when she broke. Mrs. Albright, who had sat with cold, silent composure for the entire trial, finally shattered. The mask of the respected community pillar disintegrated, revealing the monster underneath. She surged to her feet, her chair scraping violently against the floor. Her face was a mask of crimson rage, her perfectly manicured hands shaking. "You!" she shrieked, her voice a venomous hiss that echoed through the silent courtroom. She pointed a trembling finger at me. "You! You were always a worthless, meddling little brat. You were nothing then, and you're nothing now. You're just a number." The judge's gavel crashed down. "Order! Order in the court! Madam, you will control yourself." But it was too late. The jury had seen, everyone had seen. In front of God and a federal court, she hadn't just confessed to her crime. She had confessed to my wound. She had validated a lifetime of pain, and in doing so, she had just signed her own conviction. Mrs. Albright's shriek was still echoing in the silent courtroom when the jury filed back in. Her outburst had sealed her fate more effectively than any closing argument could have. They hadn't even needed 3 hours. The jury foreman, a middle-aged man with a tired but resolute expression, handed the verdict form to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. The rustle of that single piece of paper was the loudest sound in the world. The judge read the verdict, his voice a dispassionate monotone that offered no comfort to the guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit wire fraud, guilty. On the charge of money laundering, guilty. On and on it went. 12 counts in total. 12 final, unassailable numbers. Each word landed like a hammer blow, building not a cage of steel, but one of absolute, inescapable truth. I watched, my face a carefully composed mask of professional neutrality, as 2 U.S. Marshals moved behind Mrs. Albright. The quiet click of the handcuffs locking around her wrists was the final punctuation mark on a life built on lies. The woman who had made me a number, who had reduced countless children to entries in her black leather ledger, was now becoming a number herself. Federal inmate number 77291. She would be an asset to be managed, a mouth to feed, a bed to fill. The irony was devastatingly perfect. As the marshals led her past the prosecution table, her path intersected with mine for one last time. Her eyes, filled with a venomous, impotent hatred, locked onto me. Her mask of civility was gone, leaving only the raw, ugly thing that had hidden beneath it for 60 years. I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. As she drew level with me, I leaned forward slightly and said, my voice low and clear for her ears only, "The numbers don't lie, ma'am." For a fleeting second, I saw the last of her composure crack, a flicker of pure shock in her eyes before she was led away forever. I pushed my chair back and stood up, the tension of the past 3 months suddenly flooding out of me, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. The assistant U.S. attorney clapped me on the shoulder, his face beaming. "Great work, Hale. Truly great work." I nodded, accepting the praise, but my mind was already elsewhere. The mission was over. It was time to file my final report. I walked out of the courtroom doors and into the controlled chaos of the courthouse hallway. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, but the marshals formed a protective bubble. The crowd seemed to part for me as I moved through it, and then I saw him. Standing near the far wall, away from the worst of the media scrum, was General Thorne. He wasn't in uniform. He was wearing a simple, impeccably tailored navy blue suit, but he still radiated an aura of command that silenced the space around him. He wasn't looking at the cameras or the reporters. He was just standing there, watching me. My training kicked in. I squared my shoulders and began walking toward him, my path direct and purposeful. My objective, to find my superior officer and deliver my after-action report. He saw me coming and straightened up, a silent acknowledgement passing between us. As I closed the last few feet between us in the middle of that chaotic hallway, he did something that stopped my world on its axis. General Thorne, a man who commanded divisions and conversed with presidents, slowly and deliberately drew himself up to his full, imposing height. He looked me directly in the eye, and as the cameras flashed and reporters yelled, he raised his right hand to his brow in a slow, formal, perfectly executed military salute. The hallway fell silent. The cacophony of the media died away into a collective, stunned hush. A 3-star general was saluting a warrant officer. It was a flagrant breach of protocol. It was a gesture that defied every rule of rank and custom in the book. It was the most profound and personal expression of respect one soldier could give another. It was the recognition I had unknowingly craved my entire life. In that single, silent gesture, the invisible girl from St. Jude's, the bean counter in uniform, the number that was told to never be anything more, simply vanished. A thick, painful lump formed in my throat. Hot tears pricked the corners of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. My military bearing was the only thing I had left to hold on to. I couldn't return the salute. Protocol dictated you don't salute an officer in civilian clothes. It would have lessened the meaning of his gesture. Instead, I did the only thing I could. I snapped my body to the rigid, formal posture of attention, my arms straight at my sides, my chin up. I held his gaze and gave a single, sharp, decisive nod. Sir. That salute wasn't a medal to be pinned on a uniform. It was more than that. It was absolution. It was a silent, powerful acknowledgement that washed away every insult, every dismissal, every moment of doubt I had ever felt. It was a voice, louder than all the others, that said, "You are not a number. You are a hero. And I see you." As General Thorne slowly lowered his hand, the noise of the hallway rushed back in, a chaotic wave of sound. But he seemed oblivious to it. He ignored the shouting reporters and the flashing cameras. He looked at me, and with all the power and protocol of the United States Army stripped away, he was just a father. He asked the only question that truly mattered. "My daughter." His voice was a raw whisper, heavy with 15 years of hope and fear. I had anticipated this. From my briefcase, I pulled a single, sealed manila envelope. It was the final piece of the investigation, the one report that would never be entered into official CID files. I handed it to him. His strong, steady hands trembled almost imperceptibly as he took it. "Her name is Maria, sir. She's 28 years old. And she's safe." My own investigation, conducted quietly in the weeks leading up to the trial, had found her. She's a landscape designer living in Portland, Oregon. The family who acquired her gave her a good life. They never knew the truth. They passed away a few years ago. I watched as he processed the information, his eyes scanning my face, searching for the details my words left out. "I've made contact through a third party, sir," I added gently. "She knows you're looking for her. She knows the truth about who she is." I paused, choosing my next words carefully. "She's scared, sir, and confused. Her entire life has been turned upside down, but she's ready." A single tear escaped his eye and traced a path down his weathered cheek. He didn't bother to wipe it away. The formidable 3-star general was gone, replaced by a man whose lost child had just been found. He clutched the envelope to his chest as if it were the most precious thing in the world. "Thank you, Warrant Officer Hale," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for bringing my daughter home." 1 year later, I was standing in a different office. This one was mine. It was on the E-ring of the Pentagon, with a view overlooking the city of Washington, D.C. After the Albright case, General Thorne had used his considerable influence. The Department of Defense realized that the complex web of shell corporations and financial loopholes that Albright had used to traffic children could also be used by terrorists and foreign agents to move money. My niche skill set was suddenly in very high demand. I was now the director of a new, multi-agency unit, the Advanced Threat Logistics Analysis Service, or Task Force Atlas. Our mission was to use the data mining methodologies I had perfected to proactively hunt for human trafficking and terror financing networks that exploited federal and military welfare systems. We didn't react to crimes anymore, we predicted them. We followed the numbers to find the monsters before they could create more victims. The accountant in uniform was now commanding a team of the brightest financial analysts and data scientists from the NSA, FBI, and Treasury Department. My real family was now the team of brilliant, dedicated people I had handpicked, a group who saw the numbers not as boring data, but as the silent screams of the vulnerable. My eyes drifted across my clean, organized desk. It was a landscape of my new life. There was the official challenge coin from the director of CID, given to me in a surprisingly humble ceremony. There were photos of my team. And there, sitting in a simple silver frame, was a new picture. It had been taken 2 months ago, on a sunny Saturday afternoon in General Thorne's backyard in Virginia. It was a classic American scene. Thorne, looking relaxed and happier than I'd ever seen him in a faded polo shirt and jeans, had his arm draped around Maria. Her smile was still as bright as it was in the old photo, but now it was deeper, more knowing. And standing next to them, smiling awkwardly and holding a spatula over a smoking grill full of burgers, was me. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was a beginning. Maria and her father were navigating the strange, complicated path of becoming family after a lifetime apart. There were decades of lost time that could never be recovered. But they were trying. And I was there. No longer an outsider, no longer just a number, but a part of their new, fragile, beautiful reality. We were a family forged in tragedy, bound by truth, and learning to heal over the simple ritual of a backyard barbecue. Mrs. Albright taught me that I was a number, and in a way, she was right. I am a creature of numbers, of data, of patterns. But she, in her cold, transactional view of the world, forgot the most important variable. She forgot that in the hands of a trained American soldier, a number can become intelligence. It can become evidence, a witness, a weapon. And sometimes the most important investigations, the ones that truly define a career, aren't about the millions of dollars recovered. They're about the single life brought home. They're about finishing the mission, no matter the cost, and reminding the world of a simple, fundamental truth that the Mrs. Albrights and Colonel Jenningses of the world will never understand. No human being is ever a zero. My journey from a forgotten number at St. Jude's to the director of Task Force Atlas taught me one thing above all else. The parts of our story that we believe are our greatest weaknesses can, in fact, become our greatest strengths. Your unique experiences, even the painful ones, have shaped you into the person you are today, equipped with a perspective no one else has. If this story resonated with you and you believe in the power of rewriting your own narrative, then please hit that subscribe button and join our community here. We share stories like this every week to remind every single one of us that our past does not define our future. Thank you for listening.